Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats or lawyers in negotiating peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by my good friend, Visuvanathan Rudrakumaran, who is an attorney of law in the United States and the former legal advisor to the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE. Rudra is currently heading the transnational government of Tamil Eelam in exile as its prime minister. In today's conversation, we will draw upon Rudra's extensive experience advising a non-state armed actor involved in peace negotiations and the significant efforts that he led to lawyer peace in Sri Lanka. Rudra, I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor William. It's nice to be here. I am delighted to talk about this important topic.
Great. Well, let's dive right in and kick off with the first question, which is probably the most difficult question. Can you give us a brief context of the background to the conflict in Sri Lanka that led to the Thailand negotiations in 2002, just to situate the conversation for our listeners?
Okay. Before the colonial powers came to Sri Lanka, there were Tamil Kingdom and Sinhala Kingdom. When the British came, then they amalgamated both kingdoms. And when they gave independence in 1948 at that time Sri Lanka was known as Ceylon, they gave power to the Sinhala majority in return of geopolitical benefits, having bases in Trincomalee and Katunayaka. When the Sinhala when they got the political power, they intended and they still intend to make Sri Lanka as a Sinhala Buddhist country. So they discriminated the Tamils against education, employment, etc. Tamil lands have been colonized. Tamils were subjected to racial pogroms. Actually, from 1953 until 2006, there were 157 racial pogroms. So the Tamils were treated as not only as second-class citizens. They tried to assimilate the Tamils into the Sinhala politics. So the Tamil political leaders at that time waged non-violent struggle. But unfortunately, those non-violent struggles were crushed by the Sri Lankan state. Due to the above, coupled with the fact there is no internal or international forum to resolve national conflicts, Tamils as a last resort engage in armed resistance. And this armed resistance is based on the international law concepts of self-determination, self-defense, and self-help. So during the latter part of 90s, and I must say that LTT initially declared a unilateral ceasefire on December 24th of 2000. This is 9 months before September 11th. So in 2000, then LTT launched some very successful military campaign, capturing Elephant Pass, a strategic area, and attack on military aircrafts in Katunayaka. During that time, the government faced military debacle because they launched Operation Fire Flame, which was a massive failure for the government. During this time, the central bank issued a report saying that the armed conflict contributes to an economic drain for the country. And during this time, the opposition party leader, he ran on an election, for the parliamentary election, he ran on a platform calling for a negotiated settlement. All these factors contribute to the commencement of peace talks. But I want to emphasize the main factor that made the peace talks possible was the symmetry of power, the military parity that LTT established on the ground.
Okay, so the non-state armed actor of the LTT had created symmetry, parity with the government forces. Yeah. And that set the context for the negotiations in Thailand. Sure. Well, Rudra, thanks for that big picture context. Now let's move to the other end and talk about your personal experience. You're in your office in the United States, practicing law, your phone rings, and you're asked to be the lawyer in the peace negotiations. How did that happen? What went through your mind? And how did you prepare to get on a plane and go to Thailand?
Okay. Actually, my phone didn't ring. What happened? What happened was I was informed that the LTT's chief political advisor, Dr. Anton Balasingham, who was in London at that time, wanted to see me in person. So I went to London to see him. And when I met him, then he told me that I would be a member of the LTT delegates during the first round of talks. But I must also say that even before that encounter, I was writing and making presentations on self-determination. And one of my presentations entitled Criteria for Solution, which I gave it in Norway at St. Michael's Institute, got wider coverage. And during that time, I also had coordinated legal proceedings in US and Canada against the designation of LTT as a terrorist organization. So I was not an outsider. But Dr. Balasingham said that I would be a delegate. And I also, at that time, I realized that thousands of people have given their lives for the Tamils to have a seat at the negotiating table. So I considered it as a sacred mission. So when I came to New York, the first thing I did, I ordered 6 volumes of peace treaties starting from 1640. It is still there. I hope at some point it become useful. So that's what it all started. Yeah.
Now, from that very first day, what were your perceptions of the delegation, the non-state armed actor delegation? Because one of the things we try to do on these podcasts of Lawyering Peace is dive into, what's it like lawyering for a state? What's it like lawyering for a mediator? What's it like lawyering for a non-state armed actor?
No, I realized, even I was aware of the fact that we are going to engage in this process, in this exercise, in the context of an asymmetrical world. Because we know the whole system, the whole international system. In other words, it was and it is an international state system. States are the primary actors of the system. Even if you take the international institution, whether it's UN or the IMF, states are the parties, states are the members. So we, the non-state actors, we have to face this asymmetrical context. And I personally, I still believe for a successful negotiation, power symmetry is an important factor. So the challenge for a lawyer in the non-state actors delegation is to ensure that the power symmetry which was created on the ground is maintained throughout the process. So that was my thinking when we started the negotiations.
And I assume the delegation was well aware of the asymmetry at the negotiation table. They had created the symmetry on the battlefield in the geographic context, and now they're at an asymmetrical arrangement. What were some of the strategies that the delegation employed in the negotiations? And then in addition, what were some of your legal strategies that you employed in order to create parity in the negotiations?
Initially, what happened was, from 2 perspectives, the state as well as the international powers tried to create an asymmetrical relationship or to perpetuate an asymmetrical relationship. For example, if you look at the importation of arms, the LTT was not allowed to carry arms to their area because the ships carrying LTT arms were sunk, whereas the Sri Lankan government was allowed to bring arms. So had the international powers imposed a moratorium on the importation of arms by the Sri Lankan government, I think it would have helped to maintain the strategic equilibrium or the power symmetry. But unfortunately, that did not happen. And also Sri Lanka as well as the international powers use law as a tool to perpetuate an asymmetrical relationship. Well, before the beginning of the talk, before the commencement of the talks, LTT insisted that the Sri Lankan government should revoke the designation of LTT as a terrorist organization. Because in my view, the fact that Sri Lanka designated LTT as a terrorist organization did not have any tangible impact on the LTT's ability to launch a military offensive. But LTT insisted because they wanted to represent the Tamils as their authentic representative at the negotiating table. So it was a matter of dignity. And the Sri Lanka, because LTT was strong at that time, the Sri Lankan government gave in and they revoked the designation. When I look back, I think probably LTT should have even insisted that, that any third-party states who want to involve in the peace process as a prerequisite, that they should revoke the terrorist designation of one of the parties to the negotiating process, because it really had an impact. Because we take, for example, what during the Washington Donor Conference. Okay, during the Washington Donor Conference, LTT was not invited to the donor conference on the ground, on the excuse that LTT was on the terrorist list. In my view, even the LTT was on the list, there were and there are waivers to get the LTT members to Washington. And if I remember correctly, during that time, a member of, or leader of FARC, the Colombian organization, when FARC was on the list at that time, he came to Washington. Even otherwise, okay, say you cannot bring them here. They should have had the conference in UK where Dr. Andrew, which also designated LTT as a terrorist organization during that time, but Dr. Balasingham was living there. So these things, these kind of measures really created an asymmetrical relationship, and then that was very harmful to the peace process, and I would say that contributed to the collapse of the peace process. I'm thinking back, so I think maybe the lawyers should have engaged in some proactive, some creative activities during type of situations. I'm thinking probably the lawyers should have, or including myself at that time, should have engaged in lawfare. I know the lawfare is a negative connotation, but it can be used for a positive purpose to secure justice. See, during that time, Sri Lanka ranked only second to Saddam Hussein's regime with respect to enforced disappearance. And a lot of military leaders came for the talks to third countries. I'm thinking maybe at that time we should have persuaded the host governments or the host NGOs, the NGOs in the host countries, to bring legal action under universal jurisdiction against these military leaders. I think that would have contributed, that would have added a soft power to the non-state actor. So I think the lawyers should engage in some creative activity, not simply advising the client or not simply writing about the nitty-gritty of writing agreements. I think the lawyers should engage in some pro-creative actions to ensure that the power balance is maintained, or to add the soft power to the non-state actor.
And Rudra, I think we're seeing that now in the case of Ukraine and other conflicts where, you're right, lawfare initially had a negative connotation. Yeah. But now if you ask the Ukrainians, they're engaging in lawfare against the Russians because the law is on their side. The Russians are committing atrocity crimes. And so I think that's really great advice for lawyers advising parties in an asymmetrical relationship. Use lawfare outside of the negotiating room in the way that other states use law or use force.
Yeah, but personally, the TGT is also engaged in this kind of a lawfare with respect to designation. We hope we can go after some other, we can expand this lawfare to some other areas. And in fact, I also would like to say just one more thing. Even in Sri Lanka, I just learned recently that because the church, the Mannar bishop, has filed a legal action against one of the projects of Mr. Adani, an Indian successful businessman in Mannar, and they have lodged a complaint in the Sri Lankan Supreme Court saying that it harms the environment of Tamil areas. So people are now started to engage in this lawfare. I think that should be encouraged, and we should support that.
Starting to use the rule of law in order to develop that parity. So Rudra, let's go inside the negotiating room. So there's 4 or 5 members on your delegation, presumably 4 or 5 on the government's delegation. What type of advice did you give your clients to try to strengthen their position in the negotiating room, either just strategic advice or legal advice? How did you try to accomplish parity and maintain that inside the confines of the delegation?
The LTT's initial goal when they entered into negotiation to set up an interim administration to address the immediate humanitarian needs of the war-affected people. So during the first round of talks, both sides talked about it, and we came to a kind of a consensus that we'll set up an interim administration. But unfortunately, what happened during the second round of talks, the government came and said that the Attorney General is saying that it is not acceptable, the Constitution would not allow to have an interim administration. But you should remember the two things I would say. First, when Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe ran for the election, in his election manifesto, he explicitly stated that if he wins, that he would establish an interim administration to address these humanitarian needs. So he got the mandate for that from the Sinhala people. And the second point, the main reason for the armed conflict, because the Tamils did not and do not accept the Sri Lankan constitution. Whether it's a 1972 Sri Lankan constitution or the 1978 Sri Lankan constitution, Tamils did not participate in the constitution making. Tamils did not even consent to those constitutions. Those constitutions were imposed on the Tamils. So given that, then you come to the negotiating table and you say, we want to have any kind of a settlement, either interim settlement or a permanent settlement within the parameters of the existing constitution. Did not make any sense and does not make any sense even now. And it really impacted, because then we take after the tsunami, the massive destruction. Then both parties agreed and set up a mechanism called P-talks. Okay, that according to that mechanism, the aid would go directly to the south as well as to the north. What happened? The Sri Lankan Supreme Court said that the Sri Lankan Constitution doesn't allow this kind of a mechanism. So I think at the beginning of the talks, the third party should have made it clear, what we are going to do is outside the purview of the Constitution. And once we reach a political consensus, then maybe we can think about bringing a constitutional amendment or anything like that. But that was the biggest fallacy.
We've experienced that in advising various parties on peace talks. Oftentimes the government will show up and say, sure, we're happy to negotiate, so long as it's consistent with our constitution. But as happened with the LTT, that substantially shrinks the room for negotiation.
Yeah.
Now, in others, like the Macedonian Lake Ohrid negotiations, the peace agreement was a series of 14 amendments to the Constitution. So they actually went in and said, right, we agree, we're going to negotiate to amend the Constitution. And I think you're right. In hindsight, that might have been a way of creating an open space. And as you say, the responsibility of the mediators to say, look, everything is on the table.
Yeah.
Nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon.
The other thing I also would like to say, during that time, when the ceasefire agreement was signed, there should have been another ceasefire agreement talk about the movements in the sea, because that created the problem. Because during the peace talks on two occasions, if I remember correctly, on one occasion, the Sri Lankan Navy impounded LTT boat, and they were trying to tow it to the naval camp. And then the SLM got involved, but nothing happened. Finally, what happened? Those people, the LTT cadres, they committed suicide. Then during that time, even in international waters, LTT ship was attacked and nearly 12 people, including the captain, got killed. So there was no agreement about the movement in the sea. That was also another cause for the failure. And during these peace talks, then I, as a legal advisor, then with the help of experts, I prepared a ceasefire agreement with respect to the movements in the sea. But for some reason, it did not see the light of the day.
Yeah, no, I recall there was the partial ceasefire only relating to the land, and then leaving everything on the sea under the sovereignty and territorial integrity principles of the government of Sri Lanka and their navy. Rudra, when you're sitting there in the delegation room with the non-state armed actors, and they're thinking, okay, tomorrow the peace negotiations open, the government has all of the resources of a government to prepare for negotiations. The mediators, Thailand, they've done this before in other contexts. how do you work with your delegation? Because you were, the legal advisor, but presumably they turned to you for strategic advice and tactical guidance. What were some of the ideas that you shared with the LTTE, the non-state armed actors, to represent themselves on the same platform as the government and the mediators? And I ask this because in many circumstances, if we're advising a non-state armed actor in the negotiations, the government will use its status as a state actor to essentially intimidate, and as my younger professional colleagues would say, cast shade upon the non-state party, be it an armed actor or civil society. And the mediators succumb to that a little bit as well. Were there certain strategies or tactics that you used with the delegation or advised the delegation to employ?
I must say, so when we went to Thailand for the first round of talks, at the venue there was a big banner, it says Sri Lanka peace talks. I said it should have been Sri Lanka LTT peace talks. It's not a Sri Lanka peace talks. So from beginning onwards, even Norway with good intention, but Norway is also part of the same international state system. So what they did was to try to confine this whole thing within the Sri Lankan polity, and also then I'll talk about territorial integrity and so on. So that was the problem we faced. And then one of the things we tried to, then that's it. It was not my idea, it was the idea of the Tamil national leader, Mr. Prabharan, to bring the Tamil diaspora, because he felt that we don't have the resources like what the government has. So to compensate that, he brought the Tamil diaspora and to tap the skills of the Tamil diaspora. Then we formed the Constitutional Affairs Committee, bringing eminent Tamil lawyers, law professors, including the former Attorney General of Sri Lanka, Mr. Shoha Pasupati. He was in the team, and various professors, well-known professors. So what the LTT leadership tried to balance it by bringing the Tamil diaspora to tap their skills, to try to make it as a leveling the playing field as a level one, so that it won't have any asymmetrical thing. But we face this problem. We face this problem throughout the process.
So, Rudra, what advice do you have for other non-state actors who bring in the diaspora? In our experience, we've worked with Armenia, the Kosovo Albanians, others, the Syrians. They bring in the diaspora. The diaspora is a different community than the local community. How, and each diaspora is different. And I know that the Tamil diaspora is exceedingly tight with the local community. But any suggestions, any things that work really well for weaving the diaspora into the delegation that you could share with future non-state armed actors?
Yeah, because nowadays even we have this kind of a criticism from some quarters that Tamil is kind of a remote nationalism, that Tamil diaspora live far away and trying to control the events of what happens in the homeland. In my view, the diaspora has more moral authority, because most of the diaspora, especially the Tamil diaspora, they left Sri Lanka because of the armed conflict, because of the persecution. So they have every right to talk about this issue. So I did not see at that time there was a divergence of opinions between the Tamils inside the island of Sri Lanka and the Tamil diaspora. So I think that personally the diaspora, not only in Sri Lanka, in the Tamil community, but even especially if you take the Indian community also, the diaspora is becoming a powerful force. And because of the globalization and this technological connections, and we think that the diaspora can play a very important and positive and constructive role. So that's what I would say. I would say that we have to bring any community, bring the diaspora also, as we should treat it as one of the elements of soft power, to try to balance the asymmetric the playing field.
And oftentimes the diaspora are able to operate in not only a more physically secure environment, but also in a more technologically secure environment. We talk a lot now about cyber infiltration of delegations, and having a cohort of advisors in the diaspora allows a non-state actor to do what a state does, have secure cyber communication, and also have physical security while they're thinking and strategizing. Let's turn now a little bit to the internationals. We've talked about the international bias towards state actors because the international community is comprised of states. Even when you interact with the United Nations, is comprised of 216 member states who control what happens at the United Nations. But when you have a conflict between two parties, nearly all of the time, the answer for a process is, let's bring in a third party actor, let's bring in an international entity. Can you share with us some of your experience with the Thailand, the Thai government, also with the Norwegians who played a crucial role, and any other international actors that played a role in either facilitating the negotiations or attempting to mediate the conflict?
Yeah, sure. Norway was the main facilitator of the talks, but at the same time, US, UK, and Japan also part of the parties to the peace process. But unfortunately, what happened was, because since they were also states, their attitude or their announcements were not helpful to a successful peace process. For instance, I think during the Norway Oslo Peace Donor Conference, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, he came there and he made a speech at the donor conference. And what he was saying openly there was that LTT should make a public renunciation of stating that it is giving up armed struggle for an independent state. That is not called for. That is not called for. That was a donor conference to talk about the immediate humanitarian needs of the war-affected people. And then the Japan got involved also. The Japan said, okay, we want to have a donor conference in Tokyo. Then when we asked the Norwegians why Japan is getting involved, the Norwegians' immediate answer at that time was Japan wants to have some visibility. They've been doing a lot of humanitarian help, but they are not getting any recognition. So they want to have some political visibility. That's what they want. But then eventually what happened, Japan tied the economic aid to the progress in the peace talks. So nothing happened as far as the aid is concerned. The Tamils never got any aid. So I come back to Mr. Armitage's comment. That was because I can talk about that issue, the legitimacy of the Tamil struggle for independence. In fact, I did research nearly 3-4 years when I was a graduate student at Harvard and published articles, and I don't want to get into that. But then what the perception of it was a fact also. Rani, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, mobilizing the countries, the third countries who are involved in the peace process, to set up a safety net and try to contain the LTT, put parameters on what kind of political agenda LTT can have. This is not favorable. How can you impose parameters only on one party to the conflict and give a free hand to the other party of the conflict? So unfortunately, in the Sri Lankan peace process, the third parties, the third states' actions were not conducive for a successful peace process. In fact, they contributed, in my view, to the collapse of the peace process.
Rudra, I'm so glad you shared that perspective. Whenever I teach my class or whenever I have a new client and they're going into bilateral negotiations that are mediated, I always say there's no such thing as a bilateral negotiation. If you've got a perpendicular table at the end and there's a mediator, it's a trilateral negotiation because mediators have their own interests. They're there for a reason. And no one ever believes me. And then like 3 months later, they're like, oh my gosh, this is a trilateral negotiation. They're worse than the other side. You know, if they would just leave the room, we could get to a deal with the folks across the table. Because it is, there's no, they may be there for the right reasons, but they're still influenced by their own prerogatives, their own interests.
So unfortunately, the September 11 contributed to that one, I would say. The September 11, then that made a lot of states to view all national liberation movements through a negative lens. So that also contributed. But anyhow, I don't want to go back, but that Mr. Richard Armitage's comment was really because the Tamils started to lose confidence in the impartiality and neutrality of the peace process.
So there's a donor conference that you're excluded from, and at the donor conference,
you come and say that you can
proposing political outcomes. Then there's a cautionary approach. Let's talk a little bit about the role, the facilitation. So the Thais, and then eventually towards the end, the Swiss hosted. The Norwegians facilitated. Did anybody actually mediate? Were there any international third parties that showed up and said, here's a draft agreement, or here's some points, suggested points of compromise? Or was this mostly just facilitation, getting people together in a room and, well, facilitating a conversation?
I am told, but I was not privy to the ceasefire agreement. But my understanding is for the ceasefire agreement, both parties submitted their proposals. And then Norwegians came up with the proposals, incorporating, I think, the salient features from both proposals. That is the only instance where the Norwegians came up with something on their own to ask parties to give their input. But during the peace process, the Sri Lankan government was giving their own proposals. And then they said that those proposals, as you can imagine, they did not meet the aspirations or meet the demands of the Tamils. So then what we did then, why don't we give the proposal? Why don't the Tamils give a proposal? Why you always have to wait for the government to give a proposal? Then we got all these diaspora experts, foreign experts, and we came up with the interim self-governing authority, a proposal from the Tamil side. But it should be emphasized, even when the LTT submitted that proposal to the government, they said it is negotiable. They did not say take it or leave it. They said it is negotiable. But when the LTT submitted the proposal, what the Chandrika, there was also the power struggle between the president and the prime minister in Sri Lanka. So when LTT submitted the proposal, what Chandrika, the president, did was he took away some of the ministers from the prime minister, and at the time he was in the US, he was meeting, I think, maybe President Bush was at that time, he was here. And so that's the other factor that complicated, that also was not conducive because of the power struggle between the president and the prime minister of Sri Lanka during that time. So to your question, except for the ceasefire agreement, no proposal was put forward either by the facilitator or by the parties who are involved or interested in the peace process.
Well, and you mentioned as well that oftentimes we think of states as homogeneous entities, but if you have a president and a prime minister, you're going to have at least two views across the table. And maybe the foreign minister has the third view.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about this. I want to drill down and get some more detail on how you worked with the resources of the non-state actor to develop your own proposal. Because one of the things that I've experienced in these negotiations is if we're working for a state, the state has a process and a system for generating a proposal. They'll have dozens of lawyers back in the foreign ministry, the Department of Justice. The UN has a whole mediation support unit. But if you're a non-state actor, if you're civil society, like some of our pro bono clients are and some of our listeners, or if you're a non-state armed actor, and someone like me says, oh yes, and you should develop your own proposal and get your own draft on top first, they look at me like I'm crazy. But Rudra, he did it for the Sri Lankan peace talks. So what was your secret? You just didn't sit down at your computer and draft up an arrangement for interim governance for humanitarian assistance. How did you pull together? And what advice do you have for other non-state actors to get their draft on top first?
We are fortunate to have the experts, not only among the Tamil diaspora, but also the foreign experts. A lot of foreign experts came who were involved in other peace process, Bougainvillea peace process, Good Friday peace process. Those experts also came. So we studied a lot of constitutions. We studied the US Constitution, we studied the Indian Constitution, even we look at the Sri Lankan Constitution. So for example, the Sri Lankan Constitution says Buddhism is a first and foremost state religion. So then we want to copy it. We say no religion will have a first and foremost status in Tamil Nadu. So we studied all these various constitutions. And as I said, these experts were involved in other peace process. So that's what actually, if I remember correctly, we had nearly 52 drafts. We prepared 52 drafts. And then finally we sent it to the leadership, and they got some input from there. And that's how that document was prepared. And that document was no foreign country did not say that this cannot be acceptable. But Mr. Kadikam, the Sri Lankan foreign minister, said, no, this is a legal document for an independent state. he was very dismissive of it. But unfortunately, I think we could have gone forward. We could have continued the peace process based on the ISGA proposal. And as I said, LTT said it was negotiable. So I think we could have done something about it, but it didn't happen.
So Rudra, on that, how did you establish or deepen the relationship with the non-lawyers on the delegation? As you mentioned, Mr. Balasingham had said, right, Rudra, please join us on our delegation. So they understood the value of having a lawyer on the team, but oftentimes lawyers are 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the delegation. How did you get both feet in and build that trust and the confidence of the political and the military actors on the delegation?
Because the thinking was the same thing. The thinking was so as I mentioned to you earlier, even before I got involved in the peace process, I was writing about this topic. And so I'm not an outsider. So I had that advantage. Maybe in another instance where, as you said, that the phone rang and somebody took up the phone and then did not land there. So the same wavelength, I think we all had the same thinking. So I did not have any misunderstandings or any disagreements with the members of the other delegation.
Okay, so you had already established your bona fides. You were already
even before the talks. I think I established a bona fides even before the talks.
No, I only say this because when I used to work at the State Department and the legal office, the Foreign Service officers would always say, "Oh, don't call me. We'll call you if we need something, lawyer. And don't wait by the phone because we probably won't call you." So this is my reaction back to 30 years ago when I was at the State Department, always trying to explain, well, I'm your lawyer. I'm here to help. And they never really believed me. So yeah, no, I think it's helpful to know that non-state armed actors, as well as others, are quite open to legal talent and see the need.
And I would also say that even for a lawyer who is not involved in the thing, I think he has to first you have to study the history of his client, their struggle, the sacrifice they made. I think the lawyer should be part of the team rather than a distant third party trying to give some technocratic advice. So I think that will also, then the party will have the trust on the lawyer also. So you have to you have to earn that trust. The lawyers have to earn that trust of the party whom they represent.
You need to be fluent in the context, the history, the positions of the party you're representing.
Sure.
Shifting gears a little bit now to substantive issues. We talked about the ceasefire, the interim governing authority for humanitarian assistance, external self-determination. Were there other major points of contention, either predictable or unpredictable, that surfaced in the negotiations?
Yeah, sure. The number one problem we had is the Sri Lankan government's insistence to have everything within the existing constitution. The other major problem about the dismantling of the high security zone. Okay, the high security zone, that was because even in the ceasefire agreement talks about allowing the IDPs, internally displaced people, to go back to their houses and to their places. So then there was a committee was established, de-escalation committee. So it was agreed, it was our expectation that the IDPs will be allowed to go to their places. But what the Sri Lankan government's response was, especially Sarat Fonsaka, he was the military commander at that time, he came up with a plan and he said for the IDPs to go back to their places, before that, LTT should disarm themselves and also decommission their arms. And then they got to hear the report, they got Satish Nambiar from India. I don't know how he came to the picture. Vilinga Maragoda brought him, did not ask the LTT or the Tamils. He came and he also said that he submitted a report that before the IDPs can be allowed to go back to their houses, LTT should be disarmed and or decommission their arms. The ceasefire agreement did not talk anything about that. Moreover, in the government control areas, LTT cadres were not carrying arms. I can talk because in that time, then I even submitted a report as a lawyer. I did some research on humanitarian law. We put the position paper. We argue that only with respect to imperative military need, the military is allowed to occupy civilian land, civilian places, and they cannot simply. If there's no imperative military need, they cannot occupy the civilian lands. It's against humanitarian law. But that did not, because everybody was sided. They sided with the Sri Lankan government. And they said you had to first either you had to disarm and decommission. So that was the other major problem. First, the government they did not agree to have an interim administration. The other second major problem was this high security zone. Even still now, even after 15 years of the war, still they are occupying civilian lands. In fact, last year there's an institute in Auckland. They published a study. Yes, still, so this is the problem. This is the problem that is happening, and unfortunately, even we cited the law. It was not in because the assumption was state has the right to do whatever they want, and the international powers went along with that.
So they'll invoke sovereignty, territorial integrity to deny self-determination, and sovereignty to engage in, occupy high security zones.
Well, as you know, the territorial integrity might be applicable only between states, not between the people and the state. So it's not contradictory. Territorial integrity is not in contradiction with the right to self-determination. But anyway,
the World Court in the Kosovo case agrees with you. The World Court says the exact same thing. It's between states.
It's only between states, yeah.
So were there any points, looking back, were there any points in time where there was some movement, where there was a possibility, an opening for a genuine peace process?
We had an opening during the peace process. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a negative answer. And unfortunately, we never, only the first round of talks, we had some kind of a good relationship, just shaking hands and saying good morning, sharing tea and those kind of things that happened. But after that, it did not. Even the atmosphere changed. Gradually, it changed. I can say in the first round and second round of talks, we sat on a table. They are on that side. We are on the opposite side. During the final round of talks, they sat in the one side of the wall. We sat in the opposite side of the wall. There's a big gulf that itself reflected the gulf between the parties.
Even the physical arrangements.
Physical arrangement reflected that. I don't know if the Norwegians must have, yes, this is what I'm going to, because we did not tell them that it should be like that. It was arranged by the Norwegians.
They sensed that there was growing distance between the parties.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the present day situation for a little bit. There are serious and incredible allegations of atrocity crimes being committed towards the end of the war against the Tamil population. There was a commitment on behalf of the government of Sri Lanka to the UN Human Rights Council to create a hybrid tribunal. There's been efforts by Sri Lankan civil society to document, to discuss, to talk about these atrocity crimes. Where does that stand, and what needs to be done in order to weave in justice in order to secure a durable peace in Sri Lanka?
It's been 15 years since the end of the war. Okay, we have two main reports from the UN itself. Expert panel report appointed by the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the internal review report. Both reports clearly state there's a credible evidence that the crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed. Even though they did not talk about genocide, I wrote a letter to the Secretary General. Based on their own report, there are elements of the crime of genocide there. But so now 15 years, nothing has happened. You said that they initially agreed to a hybrid mechanism. But then when the new government came after that, but they said we are not going to accept any of the proposed UN commitments, the commitments they made, or UN demands. They are not going to accept any of that. And that's the present position of the Sri Lankan government. And also, because then we had a case recently on torture, of the torture of pertains to a former LTT cadets. And the Human Rights Committee came up with a very damning report on Sri Lanka. They said the impunity is entrenched in the system. Impunity is entrenched in the system. So nothing has happened. And then the High Commissioner, Michelle, in her report, she suggested the referral to the ICC. Because nothing is going to happen domestically. Because the political environment, because I don't want to be classified as a racist, but my understanding, my reading, because of the racism is entrenched and pervasive, is we are not going to have any justice for Tamils within through a domestic mechanism. So it's going to be an international play. Okay? So there are two ways we can get justice. Because the Human Rights Council passed resolution, but nothing comes out of it. But now they are but they set up an entity to collect evidence. That is good. But I think there are two ways we can bring justice. One is referral to the ICC. Okay, because they said the other countries might veto. You first send it to the Security Council and see what happens. When Sudan, even though Sudan was a client of China, China did not veto the referral of Sudan to the ICC. So the one is the referral to the ICC. Then I think we can need, I think, 163 or 148 parties to the Genocide Convention. Now, what South Africa did with respect to Israel, any country can bring an action in the International Court of Justice for a crime of genocide. So these are things TGT and other Tamil diaspora organizations are working towards it. Hope we'll get justice in the near future.
It's not going to happen domestically, even with the hybrid, that's not going to happen. So you're shifting your focus to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice.
Court of Justice, yeah.
To bring some justice, to bring some healing, to bring some truth.
Yeah. For any kind of a political resolution, the accountability must be addressed first. That is a prerequisite. Without addressing accountability, we are not going to have any kind of a political resolution.
Well, Rudra, you've been very generous with your time. I have one last question for you, and that is, what is the one takeaway that you want our listeners to take with them into their future? Many of our listeners are young professionals or mid-career professionals that are engaged in or looking to engage in peace building, representing parties in negotiations, working on mediation teams. What is it that they need to know, that they need to remember as they move forward with a career on peace building?
First thing I would say, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot be a detached, distant, or third party in the delegation. You have to be part of it. You have to understand the struggle, the sacrifice made by this party. You should earn the trust. That's the main thing. The second thing, as I said, we have to come up with some creative tools. So as I said earlier, the lawfare. So have the tool, the lawfare tool in your briefcase. And the third thing I would say, ensure that the power strategic equilibrium, the power symmetry is maintained throughout the peace process. Otherwise, it won't be a successful one.
Rudra, those are three great takeaways for future peace builders to bear in mind. It's been a real honor and privilege to have this conversation. I've known you for over 20 years. We frequently shared thoughts and ideas and had discussions on these topics. And I'm so grateful that you were generous with your time today to give us a behind the scenes look at the Sri Lankan LTTE peace process and what went right, which was only a little bit, and what went wrong, and how others might be able to avoid that in their future negotiations. So Rudra, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thanks for the opportunity. I thank you. As you said, we have known each other for more than 20 years, or maybe nearly 30 years. You've been very helpful. I hope we'll continue to have that kind of a relationship.